The letter crinkled in Edna Graves's fist like a dying thing, and she read the last line again even though she already knew it by heart. Her hands were shaking. The stagecoach had stopped, and the driver had climbed down from his box and was standing in the pale morning dust looking at her with an expression that sat somewhere between pity and impatience, and Edna could not decide which one was worse. "Harlow Station," he said. "This is where I leave you, miss." Edna looked up. The town behind him was a scattering of wooden buildings, a water trough, a feed store, and what appeared to be a saloon with a broken shutter banging in the wind. It was not Caldwell. It was not even close to Caldwell. Caldwell was where her sister lived, where the letter had come from, where the words that now lived in her chest like a splinter had been written. She had read the letter 40 miles back, when the coach had lurched through a dry creek bed and the paper had slipped from her bag, and she had opened it with the careless confidence of a woman who expected good news. She had not gotten good news. She had gotten 3 sentences from her sister Clara's neighbor, a woman named Mrs. Hollies, explaining that Clara had died of fever 6 weeks prior, that the house had been sold to settle a debt, and that there was nothing left in Caldwell worth coming to. Edna had not cried. She had gone very still, the way a person goes still when the ground beneath them has been removed and they have not yet begun to fall. Now she was in Harlow Station, which the driver confirmed was 2 towns short of Caldwell, and she had $5.40 to her name, a carpetbag with a broken clasp, and absolutely nowhere in the world she was supposed to be. "Is there a hotel?" she asked. The driver looked at the buildings. "There's a boarding house, Mrs. Fenwick's. The sign's down, but everybody knows it. And beyond this, west, I mean, what's out there?" He squinted at the flat land beyond the last building. "Crossroads about 2 miles out. Langston's ranch sits on it. Big spread. Paul Langston. He's all right, I suppose, for a man who doesn't talk much." She picked up her carpetbag. Her shoulders were straight because she had made a decision, in the way that women who have run out of options often make decisions, with a terrible, quiet clarity. She did not know yet that the crossroads would change everything. She did not know that the man standing at the fence post with his hat pushed back, and his eyes the color of creek water in summer would look at her the way no one had ever looked at her in 27 years of living. She did not know that close enough was sometimes more than enough. She only knew she had to walk. The story of how Edna Graves ended up in that dust started long before Harlow Station, before the letter, before the stagecoach, and it started the way most hard stories start, with a smaller, softer loss that a person does not fully mourn until it is too late. Edna had grown up in Lawrence, Kansas, with her father, a printer named George Graves, and her mother, a woman who made excellent bread and died of pneumonia when Edna was 11. After that it had been Edna and her father and her sister Clara, and the 3 of them had managed tolerably well, until Clara married a cattle man named Rook Fennessy, and followed him to Caldwell, Kansas, in the spring of 1876. Edna had stayed because their father was still alive then. She had worked as a seamstress, then as a teacher's assistant at the Lawrence School, then as a seamstress again when the school's funding ran dry, which it did with reliable regularity. Her father had died in the winter of 1880, and after that there was nothing holding Edna to Lawrence except habit and the absence of anywhere better to go. She had saved money carefully, the way poor women do, treating every coin as if it had feelings that could be hurt by careless spending. By the spring of 1881, she had enough for a stage ticket to Caldwell and a little more besides, and she had written to Clara to say she was coming, and Clara's response had been warm and full of exclamation points about the spare room and the garden and how the boys, Clara's 2 sons, had been asking after their Aunt Edna. What Edna had not known, because Mrs. Hollies' letter had been delayed by a series of postal misfortunes, was that Clara had been gone for 6 weeks before Edna ever stepped onto the stage in Lawrence. She had been traveling toward a ghost. The worst part was not the grief, though the grief was enormous and sat in her chest like a stone she could not put down. The worst part was the particular kind of lost she was now. A woman without a destination, without a plan, without a person in the world who was expecting her arrival. She was 30 years old in a country that did not always know what to do with women who were alone, and the only thing she had going for her was the fact that she was very, very good at not showing people how frightened she was. She walked the 2 miles to the crossroads in the morning heat, and the land out there was wide and flat and golden with dry grass, and the sky was enormous in the way that Kansas skies are enormous, like the world was showing off. She had her carpetbag in one hand and her hat in the other, and her dark hair was coming loose from its pins, and she was composing a speech in her head about whether any local ranchers might need help with cooking or mending or keeping accounts, because she was running out of options, and she intended to make the most of the ones she still had. She heard the horse before she saw the man, a steady, rhythmic clopping from the far side of a low fence where a bay gelding was being walked in a slow circle. Then the horse stopped, and a man's voice said, quietly but carrying across the still morning air, "Whoa now, easy." Edna looked up. He was tall, somewhere in his early to mid-30s, with dark hair showing beneath a weathered brown hat, and he was holding the gelding's reins with the practiced looseness of a man who had done it 10,000 times. He had his back to her. He was wearing a plain canvas shirt rolled at the sleeves, and the muscles in his forearms were visible even from the road. She noticed this and then felt faintly irritated with herself for noticing. "Excuse me," she said. He turned around. His eyes were, she thought, very nearly the exact color of the creek she had crossed on the way out of Harlow Station, a kind of green-gray-blue that could not decide what it was. They took her in quickly, the carpetbag, the loose hair, the dust on her boots, and his face did something complicated that she could not entirely read. "You've been walking," he said. It was not a question. 2 miles from Harlow Station, she confirmed. "The driver told me there was a ranch at the crossroads. I was hoping to inquire about work." "Work," he said in the tone of a man who was not accustomed to receiving this particular kind of visitor. "Cooking or mending or accounts." "I have experience with all three. My name is Edna Graves. I was traveling to Caldwell, but my circumstances have changed considerably in the last few hours." She said it plainly and without apology, because she had found that showing people exactly where you stood without embellishment was almost always better than the alternative. Something shifted in his face. He looped the gelding's reins over the fence post and came toward the gate, and up close she could see that he was perhaps 34 or 35. With sun lines at the corners of his eyes and a quality of stillness about him that was not coldness but something more like deliberate calm. "Paul Langston," he said, "this is my ranch. I know, the driver mentioned you." "What did he say?" She considered being diplomatic. "He said you were all right for a man who doesn't talk much." Paul Langston looked at her for a moment and then, very briefly, he almost smiled. "He's not wrong. Come inside. There's coffee." She followed him through the gate and across a packed earth yard toward a low, solid ranch house with a wide porch, and she noted that the place was well kept in the practical sense. The fence post straight, the water trough clean, the tools hung in order on the outside wall but spare in the domestic sense, no flowers in the window boxes, no curtains she could see, and when he opened the door and she stepped inside, her theory was confirmed. The kitchen was functional and almost austere, a good iron stove, a solid table, 4 chairs, and not much else. It was the house of a man who lived alone and had been doing so for long enough that he had stopped noticing. He poured the coffee without asking how she took it, but he set the sugar bowl and a small cream pitcher on the table without comment, which she took as a form of consideration. She sat down and wrapped both hands around the cup and let the warmth travel up her arms. "What happened in Caldwell?" he asked. He sat across from her, not close enough to crowd her, not far enough to be distant. She told him briefly, factually. Her sister, the letter, the 6 weeks, the house already sold. She told him about Lawrence and her father and the stage ticket and the $5.40, and she told him all of it in the same steady voice she had used to inquire about work, because if she started using a different voice she might not be able to stop. He listened without interrupting. When she finished, there was a moment of silence that was not uncomfortable. Outside, a rooster was making a complaint about something. "I have a cook," he said. "Mexican woman named Rosa comes from the village 2 miles south. She's been with me 6 years. I won't displace her. I wouldn't ask you to. But I keep the accounts myself and they take more time than I have. And the ranch house has needed attention for a while. Not repairs. More like," he paused, looking at the kitchen as if seeing it through her eyes for the first time. "Someone who knows what a house is supposed to be. Someone who will put curtains up," she said. "I wasn't going to say that, but you were thinking it." He looked at her directly. "I'll pay you fair wages. There's a room off the back of the house that was used as a storeroom. It's decent sized, has a window. I can have it cleared by tomorrow." "I'll take it," she said, before he could change his mind or she could talk herself out of it. "And I'll clear it myself." He nodded once, and that was the contract. No letter of reference, no formal agreement, no third party to witness it. Just two people at a kitchen table in the flat golden morning of the Kansas Crossroads, making a decision that neither of them fully understood the weight of yet. She spent the rest of that first day making herself useful with the fierce, focused energy of a woman who needs not to think. She cleared the storeroom alone, stacking crates and coils of rope on the porch with methodical efficiency. She found an old mattress in the barn, airing it out in the sun while she swept the room's plank floor. She inventoried the kitchen carefully and found it honest but limited. She looked at the account ledger when Paul brought it to her after supper, and spent 2 hours tracing the columns with her finger, finding a pattern in his numbers that was sound but could be made clearer. She did not cry about Clara until that night, alone in the room with the window that faced west, and she kept it very quiet, just the kind of crying that is mostly breathing, and she let herself feel the full size of it for a little while, the loneliness, the grief, the particular fear of a woman who has landed somewhere unexpected and must now make it into something survivable. Then she dried her face and made a list of things the ranch house needed, because that was the kind of woman she was. The ranch was larger than it appeared from the road. Paul ran cattle, close to 400 head, with 2 full-time ranch hands named Davies and Ortega, and a boy of about 16 named Clem who came on weekends and during school holiday. Rosa came each morning to cook the midday and evening meals and left before dark, and she regarded Edna's arrival with a scrutiny so complete it was almost admiring. "You can cook?" Rosa asked on the second morning. "Competently," Edna said, "but not as well as you, I suspect. I'll stay out of your way." Rosa considered this. "The bread," she said finally. "I burn the bread sometimes. You can do the bread." It was, Edna understood, a peace offering of significant proportions. She fell into the rhythm of the ranch with a speed that surprised her, and she suspected that was partly because she had always been a woman who needed a rhythm to hold onto. The accounts were genuinely chaotic, not through dishonesty, but through the accumulation of a busy man's shortcuts, and she spent 3 days untangling them with a satisfaction that she recognized was disproportionate to the task. She made curtains for the kitchen and the main room from a bolt of blue cotton she found in the storeroom, reasoning that it had been sitting there unused long enough that it was functionally hers. Paul noticed the curtains on the 4th day and stood in the kitchen doorway looking at them for a long moment. "Blue," he said. "Is that a complaint?" "No," a pause. "It's good." She turned back to the accounts, but she was aware, in a way she had not been before, of exactly how tall he was in the doorway. The trouble with Paul Langston was that he was difficult to know in the way that honest people sometimes are, not secretive, not cold, but careful. He spoke when he had something to say and not otherwise, and this was disconcerting to Edna, who had spent her life around people who filled silence with noise as a matter of reflex. His economy of words made each one heavier, and she found herself paying close attention to all of them. She learned things about him in pieces. He had come to the ranch from Missouri 7 years before, at 27. He had bought the land cheap because the previous owner had died and his heirs had wanted nothing to do with it. He had built it up slowly, carefully, in the same spirit as everything else about him. He had a brother in St. Louis he corresponded with irregularly. He had a dog, a brindle hound named Colonel, who slept on the porch and regarded Edna with deep suspicion for the first week before abruptly deciding she was acceptable and following her everywhere. What he did not tell her, and what she learned instead from Davies during a conversation about the cattle schedule, was that there had been a woman before. A woman named Margaret, from a family in Wichita, who had come to the ranch 2 years after Paul had, intending to stay, and who had lasted 8 months before deciding that the Crossroads were too isolated and too quiet and too much, and had gone back to Wichita and married a banker and was, by all accounts, perfectly content. Davies told this story with the careful neutrality of a man who liked both parties and did not wish to judge, and Edna thanked him for the coffee he had not actually given her, and went back to the house thinking about it. She thought about it because she recognized in herself a version of the same potential. She had come here by accident, not by choice. The Crossroads were isolated and quiet and demanding in the way that places built from scratch are always demanding. She could, at any point, decide that this was not her life and leave. She had no obligation to stay. But the thing was, and she noticed this with the precise, slightly reluctant attention of a woman who distrusted her own feelings, she did not want to leave. Not because she had nowhere else to go, though that was still largely true, but because she had started to notice things. The way the land changed at sunset, going from gold to amber to a deep red that had no name in any palette she knew. The way the accounts, when she had untangled them, told a story of a man building something real, carefully, without shortcuts. The way Colonel the Hound pressed his warm side against her leg in the evenings when she sat on the porch. The way Paul sometimes came and sat in the other chair on that same porch and said nothing at all, and she found that she was not looking for him to fill the silence. 3 weeks into her time at the ranch, she found the dark past. It was not hidden, exactly. Paul had never lied to her. But there are things people don't mention not because they are secrets but because they are wounds, and you learn after a while not to press on wounds accidentally. She found it in the account ledger, in a column dated to the winter of 1879, 2 years before she arrived, where there was a pattern of payments to something listed only as the Harper debt, substantial and regular, running for 14 months and then stopping abruptly. The number was significant enough that it had clearly constrained everything else: equipment purchases delayed, improvements put off, hands let go and rehired when the payments ended. She might not have asked. It was not her business. But that evening Paul came in from a long day moving the cattle to the northern pasture and sat down at the table, and she had put coffee in front of him and the ledger was still open, and he looked at it and then at her and she said simply, "The Harper debt." His jaw tightened slightly, not with anger at her, with something older. "Clayton Harper," he said after a moment. "He had the land north of mine. Good man, or he was. He borrowed from the bank in Wichita and then lost the harvest 2 years in a row, and the bank was going to take everything. He had 4 children. So you paid the debt," Edna said. "I had enough to cover it, barely. It took 14 months to recover. And Harper made it, sold up voluntarily the year after and moved his family to Colorado. Sent me a letter when he got there." Paul looked at the ledger. He didn't have to do that, write the letter. He did it anyway. Edna looked at this man who had spent 14 months constrained and limited because someone else's children needed a roof over their heads, and she felt something shift in her chest in a way that she identified immediately as dangerous. "That was an ultimate sacrifice," she said quietly. He looked at her then with those green-gray eyes. It was a loan, he would have done the same. Not everyone would. He shrugged with the slight discomfort of a man who has been caught at something good and does not know what to do about it. She closed the ledger and said, "The bread is ready if you want some." He said he did, and she turned to the oven, and the moment passed into the evening like water into dry ground. But she carried it with her. The forced choice came in the fourth week, and it came at her from a direction she had not expected. A man named Vernon Cates arrived at the ranch on a Tuesday afternoon, riding a good horse and wearing the kind of suit that looks expensive in a city and ridiculous in open country. He was perhaps 40, handsome in a florid way, and he shook Paul's hand with the practiced ease of someone who made a business of being liked. Edna was hanging the week's washing on the line when he arrived, and she saw the two men talking in the yard, Paul's posture contained and careful, Cates's expansive and easy. She didn't eavesdrop, but she could not entirely avoid hearing, and what she heard was the words water rights and proposition and considerable sum. She heard Paul say, not loudly but without any particular care about being overheard, "I'm not selling the water rights, Vernon." Cates laughed. "Don't say no yet, think about it." "I've thought about it." Cates stayed for supper, which Rosa had left covered on the stove, and Paul invited him in with the flat hospitality of a man who would not be rude even to someone he mistrusted. Edna served and cleared and tried to be invisible, which she was finding increasingly difficult in her own kitchen. Cates noticed her with the kind of attention that was not rude enough to object to, but was not comfortable either. He asked her several pleasant questions about where she was from and what her connection to the ranch was, and she answered briefly and clearly and gave him nothing to work with. After he left, Paul stood on the porch looking at the road for a while. "Who is he?" Edna asked. "Vernon Cates. He owns a lot of land east of here. He's been trying to buy up the water rights in this valley for 2 years. If he gets them all, he controls what grows and what doesn't and who can stay." "Hidden motive," she said. "Very well hidden. He has the manner of a man just making friendly inquiries." "What happens if he gets what he wants?" Paul looked at her steadily. "I lose the ranch. The cattle need that water. Without it, I'd have to sell up within a season." Edna absorbed this. "And he knows that. He's counting on it. He's already bought out 2 smaller spreads to the east. He's working his way across." "Can you stop him legally?" "I can hold my own land. That's all I can do." He paused. "He'll come back. Men like that always come back." She thought about the 14 months of the Harper debt, about the man who had built this ranch careful post by careful post over 7 years, and she felt the trap he was in with a clarity that made her angry in a way that was useful. "Then we make sure there's nothing for him to leverage," she said. "If the accounts are clean and the operation is tight, there's no pressure point." He looked at her as if she had said something surprising. "You think like a strategist." "I think like a woman who has been poor," she said. "It's the same thing." Paul Langston looked at her for a long moment in the porch light, and she felt, for the first time, the full weight of his attention. Not the polite attention he paid to things that needed doing, but the kind of attention that means a person is looking at you and seeing something they had not anticipated. She went inside before either of them had to say anything about it. The nights were where it was hardest. Not for any dramatic reason, no secret meetings in the dark, no forbidden moments, nothing that would have given a sharp-tongued neighbor anything to say. Just the ordinary difficulty of being a person who feels something and cannot yet put it anywhere. She lay in her room with the window open and the prairie night coming in, all smell of dry grass and distance, and thought about the fact that she had come here by accident, that she had intended to be somewhere else entirely, that a late letter and a dead sister and a stopped stagecoach had deposited her at this specific crossroads, and the word that kept occurring to her was close. Not as in proximity to a place, as in something that had almost not happened and then had. She was close to something she could not name. She could feel its edges. Paul was dealing with his own version of the same difficulty, though she did not know this yet. She knew he was not unaffected, because she had spent her life reading people for the small signals that told you how they actually were underneath the performance of how they were, and his signals were clear enough if you were paying attention. He found reasons to be in the kitchen more often than a man managing a cattle ranch needed to be. He asked her opinion on things beyond the accounts, on the fence repair schedule, on whether he ought to hire another hand, on a letter he had to write to a buyer in Wichita. And these were not the questions of an employer but of a man who had someone to talk to, and found that he was grateful for it. The complication arrived 6 weeks into her time at the ranch, in the form of a letter, and it was not from Vernon Cates. It was from a man named Robert Aldis in Caldwell, and it was addressed to Edna Graves at the Harlow Station Post Office, forwarded to the ranch, which meant someone in town had been keeping an eye on her correspondence with a thoroughness she found only mildly alarming. The letter was formal and careful, and explained that Robert Aldis was a lawyer who had handled Clara Fennessy's affairs, and that there was in fact a small residue of Clara's estate that had not been applied to the debt, specifically a silver brooch and a set of books, and a sum of $11 that had been held in waiting for the next of kin. It was not much, but it was Clara's, and that made it enormous. The letter also asked, gently and with legal precision, whether Edna intended to claim the items in person or preferred them forwarded. It asked for her address. It asked, carefully, whether she intended to be in Caldwell at any point in the near future. She held the letter at the kitchen table for a long time. Caldwell was still there. The destination was still there. There was still something in it that belonged to her. She was aware, sitting there with the morning light coming through the blue curtains and Colonel asleep at her feet, that she was at a decision point. She could go to Caldwell. She could retrieve her sister's few remaining things, and she could stand in the town where Clara had lived, and she could grieve properly, in the geography where the grief belonged. And after that she could decide what to do next, or she could stay. She could stay because she had work that mattered to her, and a room that was hers, and a brindled dog who needed her, and a man at the far end of her awareness who was in the process of becoming something she was afraid to name. The decision felt like a trap, and she recognized in herself the hidden motive of wanting someone else to make it for her. Paul found her with the letter and read her face before he read it, which was something she was beginning to accept he was very good at. He said, "What's happened?" She told him. He listened. He looked at the letter when she offered it, reading it carefully. "You should go," he said. She had not expected that. "I could send Davies with you. He knows the road." "I know the road," she said. "I came along it." "I meant for company." She looked up at him. There was something in his face that was doing its best to be neutral and not entirely succeeding. "Would you prefer I didn't come back?" she asked. She said it without inflection because she genuinely did not know the answer, and she needed to. He was quiet for a moment that lasted long enough to be serious. "I would prefer," he said very carefully, "that you went and did what you needed to do, and then came back if that's what you decided." "That's not a direct answer." "No," he agreed. "It isn't." He met her eyes. "Come back, Edna." It was 2 words. It was very nearly everything. She went to Caldwell on the Thursday stage, with Davies riding alongside for the first few miles until the road was well established, and then alone. The road took her north and east, and the land changed subtly as she went, the flat becoming less absolute, a few low hills, a creek with cottonwoods. She watched it all and thought about her sister. Clara had been 3 years older and considerably bolder, a woman who decided what she wanted and moved toward it without much hesitation. She had chosen Rook Fennessy at a church social and had him decided in a month and married in 3, which their father had found alarming and which Edna had envied in a way she'd never admitted. Clara had been the one who charged at things. Edna had been the one who calculated. The grief she had been managing at arm's length for 6 weeks was waiting for her in Caldwell. She could feel it sitting there just ahead, patient and certain. Caldwell was a proper town, a market town by the standards of southern Kansas in 1881, with several streets of real buildings, a hotel, a church, 2 competing general stores, and a livestock auction that brought men in on Fridays from 20 miles around. She found the lawyer Robert Aldis in a small office above the hardware store, a thin young man of perhaps 30 with careful hands and a direct manner that she appreciated immediately. He gave her the brooch and the books, which were 3 volumes of poetry that she had actually given Clara for Christmas several years ago, and the $11, and he said the appropriate things about Clara's memory with a sincerity that suggested he had actually known her a little. He also told her, gently, that Rook Fennessy had taken the children to his mother's family in Oklahoma Territory after Clara's death, which was painful to hear, but was better than the alternative she had been half imagining. She found Clara's grave in the small cemetery at the edge of town, with a plain wooden marker that would rot in a few years and need replacing, and she stood there in the afternoon heat and let herself grieve properly, without managing it or containing it. She cried until she was empty of it, or empty of enough of it that she could carry the rest. She told Clara about the ranch and the Crossroads and the dog named Colonel and the blue curtains, and she told her about the accounts and about Paul Langston and his 7 years of careful building and the Harper debt, and the way he had said come back with his eyes doing something completely different than his voice. She said, "I think I'm in love with him, Clara. I didn't mean to be. I arrived in the wrong place and I think it might have been the right one." The wind moved across the dry grass of the cemetery. Somewhere in the town a door banged. Nothing answered her because the dead do not answer, but she felt lighter than she had in weeks. She stayed the night in the hotel, washed her face in the morning, had eggs and coffee in the hotel dining room, and got on the stage back south. She was back at the ranch by late afternoon. Paul was in the yard when she came up the road, and he saw her before she saw him, and when she came through the gate he was standing at the porch steps with his hat in his hand, and an expression she had not seen on him before, a quality of relief so naked and unguarded that she felt it like something physical. "You're back," he said. "I said I would think about it. You didn't say you would come back." "I said I would think about it," she repeated, and she set down her carpetbag and looked at him in the late Kansas light. "I thought about it." He was quiet for a moment, and then he said, very quietly, and I think," she said carefully, "that I arrived 2 towns short of where I was going, and I think that might have been the best thing that's happened to me in a long time." Paul Langston looked at her, and for once the stillness he was so good at maintaining was gone, replaced by something open and almost uncertain, and he said, "Edna, yes, I want to say something. I want to say it right, so I'm going to think for a moment." She waited. Colonel came around the side of the house and sat between them, looking up at both of them with the reasonable expectation of supper. "I've been alone out here for a long time," Paul said at last. "Not unhappily. But there's a difference between a life that works and a life that means something, and I've been confusing them for a while." He was looking at her steadily. "You've been here 6 weeks, and the house makes sense, and the accounts are clean, and the Colonel won't leave your side, and I find myself thinking about what you'll say about things before I say them myself, and I'd like to know if that means the same thing to you as it does to me." It was a long speech for him. She could tell from the slight tension around his jaw that it had cost him something. "It means exactly the same thing," she said. He stepped down from the porch and closed the distance between them, and he took her hand in both of his, and she noticed that his hands were large and work-worn and very careful, and she thought that was appropriate. He didn't kiss her that evening, because he was that kind of man, the kind who understood the difference between an arrival and a commitment, and he wanted to do things in the right order. But he held her hand, and they stood there in the yard until the light was gone, and Colonel finally lost patience with both of them and went inside. The Vernon Cates problem reasserted itself in the 7th week, and it reasserted itself with the quality of a threat that had grown tired of being subtle. Cates arrived again on a Thursday, this time not alone. He had 2 men with him, both large, both quiet in the way that men are quiet when they are being paid to be intimidating rather than because quietness is their nature. He asked to speak with Paul alone, but Paul looked at Edna, who was standing in the kitchen doorway with a ledger under her arm, and said, "Whatever you have to say, you can say in front of Miss Graves. She manages the accounts." Cates's pleasant expression did not waver, but something behind it recalibrated. "Very well, I've made a decision to formalize my offer for the water rights. I'm prepared to pay fair market value, which I've had assessed by a surveyor from Wichita." He laid a paper on the table. The number on it was real and the assessment was honest, which Edna thought was almost more alarming than if it had been fraudulent. "I appreciate the offer," Paul said. "The answer is still no." Kate nodded, still pleasant. "You understand that without those water rights, I'll be applying to the county for a new assessment of the water table in this area. There's been a dispute about the source of the spring on your northern pasture. It's possible it originates on what was formerly Harper's land, now mine." There it was, the hidden motive, finally surface level, not a purchase, a claim. If Cates could argue that the spring originated on land he now owned, he could contest Paul's use of it. Edna set the ledger down on the table, opened to the page she had been carrying it to, and said, "The spring survey from 1874 places the source 300 yards inside this property's surveyed boundary. I found it in the deed records, page 47. Cates looked at the ledger. His pleasantness flickered. "I had it checked when I was organizing the records," she continued in her most neutral tone. "It seemed like the kind of thing worth knowing." "Those records would need to be verified by the county assessor," Cates said. "They were recorded by the county assessor in 1874, who was a man named Gerald Park, appointed by the territorial governor. His seal is on page 48. She turned the page. The silence in the kitchen was very complete. Paul looked at her sideways with an expression she would think about later, something that was professional appreciation and personal pride, and something warmer than both. Kate smiled, and this time it was the smile of a man revising his approach rather than abandoning it. "You've done your homework, Miss Graves. It's what I'm paid to do." He gathered his papers and left with his two large, quiet men, and the sound of the hooves fading down the road was one of the better sounds Edna had ever heard. Paul waited until the sound was gone, and then he turned to her and said, "When did you find that?" 2 weeks ago. I thought it was probably relevant. You didn't tell me. I didn't want to worry you until there was reason to." He looked at her with the full force of his attention, the kind she had been learning to stand still for. "Edna Graves," he said slowly, "you might be the most formidable person I've ever met." "I'm a seamstress from Lawrence who can't afford to be otherwise," she said. He laughed then. A real laugh, not the barely there smile she had seen before, but actual laughter, and it changed his face in a way that did something to the center of her chest, and she decided then and there that she was going to spend as much of her life as possible making that happen again. Cates did not come back. Paul Langston kissed her for the first time on the evening of her 8th week at the ranch, on the porch, with the late July sunset painting the whole flat world amber and Colonel pretending to sleep at their feet while watching them with one open eye. It was not a sudden or dramatic kiss. It was the kind of kiss that comes after a long period of two people circling toward each other with great care, and when it happened, it felt less like a beginning and more like the confirmation of something that had already been true for a while. She stayed very still for a moment afterward, and he stayed very still too, both of them aware that this was the point at which things changed in ways that could not be changed back. "I should tell you," she said, "that I had intended to be in Caldwell. I had a plan for my life that did not include any of this." What was the plan? It was not a very good plan. It was mostly about being near family and finding work and managing. She looked at him. "This is better than the plan." "I have a different kind of plan," he said, "if you're interested in hearing it." She was interested. He told her, not with a formal proposal but in the way he told her most things, straightforwardly and without performance. He told her that he wanted her to stay, not as the woman who managed his accounts, but as the woman who lived on this ranch with him as its mistress and his wife. He told her that he had been thinking about it for several weeks, and that he had no hidden motive in asking, no practical consideration that was driving it, only the simple fact that he had been happier in the 8 weeks since she arrived than in the 7 years before, and he thought that was probably something worth acting on. She said yes. She said it clearly and without qualification and with a warmth that surprised even her, and he smiled again, the full smile, and she put her hand against his jaw and felt the shape of it. They were married in October, in the small church in Harlow Station, on a day that started cold and went warm by noon as the Kansas fall sometimes does, as if the weather had consulted the occasion. Rosa came, and Davies and Ortega and young Clem, and the preacher was a man named Reverend Booth who had performed marriages in 3 different states and told them both, privately, that he could always tell which ones would last, and that this was one of them. Edna wore a dress she had made herself from a length of ivory cotton she had bought in Caldwell, and she carried a spray of dried prairie flowers, because the season did not offer fresh ones, and she thought about Clara through the whole ceremony with a tenderness that was grief and gratitude equally. Paul looked at her during the vows with the complete, steady attention she had come to recognize as his deepest form of expression, and when he said "I do," the word was very quiet and very certain, the way important things often are. They had supper at the ranch afterward, Rosa having outdone herself with a spread that covered the entire kitchen table, and Davies made a toast that was sincere if a little long, and Clem gave them a wood carving of a horse that was technically imperfect but clearly made with enormous effort, and Edna thanked him with complete sincerity. When everyone had gone and the house was quiet, Edna stood at the kitchen window looking out at the dark yard, and Paul came and stood beside her, and Colonel was on the porch, and the prairie stretched away in every direction to the dark edges of the world. And she thought about the stagecoach stopping in Harlow Station 2 towns short of where she was going, and the driver's voice saying, "This is where I leave you." And the morning walk along the road to the Crossroads with her carpetbag and her broken-clasped bag and her $5.40 and her nowhere in the world to be. She had arrived at the Crossroads expecting nothing and found everything. "Are you all right?" Paul asked quietly. "I'm extraordinarily all right," she said. "I was just thinking about the accident of it, of all of this." "What about it?" "That it almost didn't happen, that if the letter had arrived 2 weeks earlier, or if I had stopped in a different town, or if you had been out with the cattle that morning." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "The Crossroads are 2 miles from Harlow Station. If you needed to, you would have walked them eventually." "You don't know that." "No," he said. "I suppose I don't." He put his arm around her shoulders and she leaned into his side. "But you're here now." "I am," she said, "close enough." She felt him smile against the top of her head. The first year of their marriage was a year of building in every sense. They expanded the ranch operation carefully, adding 20 additional head in the spring after the accounts confirmed they could absorb the cost. Paul hired a second full-time hand, a quiet, capable man named Sutton who had come down from Nebraska after the hard winter of 1880 and needed steady work. Edna kept the accounts with an efficiency that Paul told her once had saved him at least 2 expensive mistakes, which she chose to accept as a compliment even though he had said it while looking at a ledger and not at her. She found her place in the rhythms of the ranch and the small life of Harlow Station with a kind of ease that still surprised her sometimes. She was not exactly what she would have imagined for herself if she had imagined carefully. She was not in a city, not near a library, not doing the kind of work she had once assumed would define her life. She was on a flat Kansas crossroads, managing a cattle ranch's finances, and making bread and arguing occasionally with Rosa about the proper temperature for a roasting bird, and sitting on the porch in the evenings watching the land go dark with a man who loved her in the quiet, total way of someone who had made a considered decision and intended to keep it. The betrayals came from the external world, not the internal one. Cates attempted his county assessor gambit anyway, submitting a formal dispute about the spring water rights to the Sumner County office, and Edna and Paul spent 2 days in the county seat in Wellington going through records and presenting their case with such comprehensive documentation that the assessor, a tired man named Combs who had seen every form of frontier land dispute possible, dismissed the challenge in under an hour and advised Kate's, in writing, to cease wasting the county's administrative capacity. On the way back from Wellington, Paul drove the wagon and she sat beside him, and the road was long and flat, and she read aloud from one of Clara's poetry books for a while, and then they talked about nothing in particular, and then they were quiet together in the comfortable way of people who know each other well, and she thought that this, too, was a form of love, this easiness, this not needing to perform. She also thought about Clara and the poetry books. She had placed Clara's silver brooch in the small box on the dresser in their room, and she took it out sometimes and held it, not with sadness but with something more complex, a kind of ongoing conversation with a person who could no longer talk back. Davies came to her one afternoon in the early spring of that first year, with an awkward air about him that suggested he had something to say and was not sure whether it was appropriate. She waited because she had found that waiting was often the best approach with Davies. "There's a woman," he said finally, "in Harlow Station. She works at the boarding house. She's had a hard time of it. Her husband was a bad sort and he's gone now, and she's got a daughter about 4 years old." He paused. "I was wondering if it would be all right with you if I brought her out to meet folks." Edna looked at him with full attention. Davies was perhaps 35, a solidly decent man who worked very hard and asked for very little. "Bring her to supper on Sunday," she said. Her name was June Ferris, and she had a daughter named Nell who was afraid of Colonel for about 45 seconds and then was not afraid of anything. June was a small, quiet, handsome woman with brown eyes that looked directly at things, and Davies sat beside her at supper with the careful posture of a man who is trying very hard to make a good impression and is not entirely sure how. And Edna found the whole tableau so genuinely sweet that she had to look at her plate for a moment to compose herself. Rosa, who had been watching Davies for years with the fond exasperation of an older sister, announced at the table that the pie she had made was specifically in honor of good company, which was the most effusive thing she had ever said at a supper table. June and Davies were married 14 months later, in the same small church in Harlow Station, and Edna made June's dress and stood with her as the nearest thing to family that June had in the territory. By the second fall of Edna and Paul's marriage, she was expecting their first child. She told him on a morning when the first real cold had come, and the fields were heavy with harvest and frost was on the window glass, and Rosa had made coffee so strong you could stand a spoon in it. She told him plainly, the way she told him most things, looking at his face to see what the news did to it. What it did was considerable. He went very still, the way he went still with important things, and then the stillness broke into something wide open and he crossed the kitchen in 2 steps and took both her hands and said, "Edna." "Yes," she said. "Is that all you're going to say? You didn't ask a question." He looked at her with those green-gray eyes full of something she had come to know very well by now, the deep water of what Paul Langston felt when he felt things completely, and he said, "Are you well? Are you all right? Is there anything you need?" "Coffee," she said. "Strong coffee, and if you could stop looking at me like I've become made of glass, I would appreciate it." "I'll try," he said. "I'm not sure I can guarantee it." She laughed and he smiled, and Colonel, sensing a shift in the emotional temperature of the kitchen that he had not been told about, stood up and pushed his head between them with the authority of a dog who considers himself a full member of the household. Their son was born in May of 1883, a boy they named George after Edna's father, with Paul's dark hair and eyes that could not yet decide what color they would be and lungs that announced his arrival with a conviction that Edna thought was appropriate given his parentage. Rosa arrived the same morning and declared him the finest baby she had seen in 3 counties, which may not have been strictly accurate, but was delivered with such authority that no one argued. Paul held his son for the first time with the expression of a man who has been fundamentally altered and is only beginning to understand it, and Edna, sore and exhausted and more completely happy than she had known it was possible to be, watched him from the bed, and thought about the letter in her fist in the stopped stagecoach. The driver saying, "This is where I leave you," the 2-mile walk in the morning heat. She thought, if you had gone 2 towns further, Edna Graves, you would never have had this. She thought, close enough. George Langston proved to be a child of strong opinions and considerable determination, which Paul regarded with what was clearly equal parts pride and alarm, and which Rosa greeted with the fond certainty that she had predicted exactly this outcome. He walked early and talked early, and had a habit of being in the places he was not supposed to be, not from mischief, but from genuine curiosity about everything, and Edna found him exhausting and astonishing in equal measure. Paul was a natural father in the sense that mattered most, which was not the sense of knowing what to do, because none of them knew what to do, but the sense of being fully present for it. He carried George in the mornings while Edna slept an extra hour when she could. He showed the boy the ranch with a patience that Edna noted and loved. He read to him in the evenings with the same seriousness he brought to everything else, which meant that by the time George was 2 he was being read frontier histories and natural philosophy texts that he could not possibly understand, but seemed to find deeply satisfying. Nell Farris, Davy's stepdaughter, was 3 years older and had appointed herself George's primary supervisor, a role she discharged with an authority that reminded Edna powerfully of Clara. The following year, Davies and June had a son of their own, a boy named Will, and the 2 families wove together in the way of people who live near each other and choose to build something more than proximity. Edna thought sometimes about loneliness, about the kind she had felt in that stopped stagecoach and in the night in her room in Lawrence after her father died, and she thought about how it was not the absence of people but the absence of belonging, and how she had found both here at the Crossroads in a way she could never have manufactured deliberately. In the spring of 1884, Paul made a trip to Wichita for a cattle sale and came back with 3 things: a very good price on the herd, a new mare that he had bought on impulse and was slightly embarrassed about, and a book he had found in a shop there that he thought Edna would like, a collection of botanical illustrations of prairie plants. He set it on the kitchen table without comment, as if it had just appeared there, and she picked it up and looked at it and then at him with an expression she didn't try to manage. "You found this in Wichita," she said. "There was a bookshop. You went to a bookshop in Wichita. I was walking past it." She looked at the book and then put it down and crossed to him and put her hands on his face and kissed him with a thoroughness that made him forget whatever he had been going to say about the cattle price for a good several minutes. The ranch continued to grow and stabilize, and the Cates problem resolved itself in the most mundane way possible, which was that Vernon Cates overextended his land purchases in the county to the east, took on too much debt servicing, and quietly sold up and moved to Denver in the fall of 1884. Paul heard about it from the county assessor's office in a letter confirming the resolution of all pending water disputes, and he read the letter at the kitchen table and then handed it to Edna and said nothing. She read it and said, "Good. That's all. That's everything." He took the letter back and put it in the file where they kept resolved matters, and that was the end of Vernon Cates. The betrayal that left the deepest mark was one that came from outside the valley altogether, in a letter from Paul's brother Edmund in St. Louis in the late fall of 1884. Edmund Langston was, Edna had gathered from Paul's occasional references, a clever and restless man who had made money in the St. Louis dry goods business and was always in the process of making more. The letter was friendly in its surface and deeply troubling underneath, describing a scheme Edmund had become involved in, purchasing land in the Oklahoma Territory through a series of intermediaries in a way that Paul immediately recognized, and told Edna quietly and with some anger, as the kind of speculation that profited from the forced displacement of Osage families who had already been relocated once by treaty. He wrote back to Edmund that same evening. Edna, who was putting George to bed in the next room, heard the scratch of the pen and the particular silence that meant Paul was choosing words carefully. When she came back to the kitchen, he sealed the letter and looked up at her. "I told him I want no part of it," he said. "And why? What will he say? He'll be annoyed. Then he'll see sense." A pause. "He's not a bad man. He sometimes doesn't look at what he's doing closely enough." She thought about this, about the way ordinary people participated in injustices not through malice but through the habit of not looking, and she said, "You looked." "You make it easier," he said simply, "to see things clearly." She sat down across from him. Outside, the fall wind was pressing at the window, and George was making the small sounds of a child settling into sleep. "Paul." "Yes, I love you," she said. Not because she had not told him before, but because she wanted him to hear it in that specific moment, in the kitchen at the Crossroads where she had arrived by accident and stayed by choice. He looked at her across the table with the full stillness of his deepest attention and said, "I love you, Edna. I have since about the 4th day. You didn't show it. I showed it to Colonel. He was more approachable." She laughed until George made a louder sound from the next room, and she covered her mouth, and Paul was grinning. And it was one of those moments that does not feel like a moment until later, when you understand it was actually the whole story in miniature. Edmund Langston, as predicted, came around. His reply was huffy and defensive for the first half, and then honest for the second half, and he withdrew from the scheme and wrote to say so. He also wrote, in a postscript that he appeared to find more difficult than the main body of the letter, that the example of Paul's position on the matter had been useful to him in clarifying his own thinking, and that he was glad one of them had stayed fixed on something real. He visited the ranch the following summer, in June of 1885, arriving by stage from Wichita and walking from Harlow Station with his hat in his hand, because he had misjudged the distance, which Edna found charming and which she told him was a family tradition. Edmund was a year older than Paul, dark like him but with a nervous energy where Paul had stillness, and he talked considerably more and laughed easily and was immediately enchanted by George, who regarded his uncle with the measuring quality of a 2-year-old who has opinions. "He looks like you both," Edmund told Edna on the porch the first evening. "He looks like himself," she said. "We're just learning to recognize it." Edmund stayed a week, and by the end of it he and Paul had reached the kind of ease between brothers that required the distance of years to fully develop, a warmth with enough space in it for both of them to be who they actually were. He left on a Thursday morning with his bag over his shoulder and turned at the gate and looked back at the ranch house, the straight fences, the full water trough, the kitchen window with the blue curtains, Edna standing at the porch with George on her hip and Colonel beside her. "You built something real," he said to Paul. "We did," Paul said. Edmund nodded, satisfied, and walked away down the road toward Harlow Station. The following spring, Edna discovered she was expecting again, and this time the news felt different, not less significant but more settled, like something they had anticipated and were ready for, which they were. She told Paul in the evening on the porch, and he took her hand in both of his as he had the first time, and he said, "How do you feel?" "Certain," she said. "Is that a feeling?" "It is right now." Their daughter was born in November of 1886, during a cold snap that put ice on the window glass and kept the horses stamping in the barn, and they named her Clara, which was the name Edna had known from the beginning would be the name, and which she said for the first time when the baby was in her arms and the midwife had gone and Paul was sitting on the edge of the bed with a face that was barely managing to be a face. "Clara," she said. He looked at her. "After my sister," she said. "She would have been ridiculous about her, completely doting. She deserves to have that." He put his hand against the baby's head so gently and said, "Clara." The name settled in the room and in the ranch, and it stayed there from that day forward. George, who was 3½ and had been consulted extensively on the subject of a sibling, received Clara Langston with a gravity that made everyone around him fight to keep a straight face, before presenting her with a smooth stone he had found in the creek, and declared, in his serious, small voice, his. Edna watched her son present his sister with a creek stone and felt the full, improbable abundance of where she had arrived. She had come here by accident, 2 towns short, with $5.40 and a letter full of bad news and a broken clasped carpetbag, and the man at the crossroads had said she was close enough, and she had been, and she was. Close enough had turned out to be exactly right. The years settled and grew, and the ranch grew with them, and the crossroads changed in the way that places change when they are lived in fully. The house acquired more curtains, better in the kitchen and in the children's rooms, and a shelf of books that gradually expanded from Clara's 3 volumes of poetry to a proper collection, because Paul made a habit of bringing Edna books from Wichita and Wellington, and once, on a trip to Topeka for a cattlemen's meeting, a volume of botanical illustrations that was considerably better than the one he had found before. She expanded the account system as the ranch expanded, developing a method that Paul taught, with evident pride, to young Clem when Clem came of age and took on proper work at the ranch. She wrote letters regularly to Robert Aldous in Caldwell, who had become something like a correspondent and friend, exchanging legal opinion for her thoughts on the broader questions he occasionally encountered, a small, practical cross-correspondence that she valued. She went back to Caldwell twice more, both times with Paul, the second time with the children as well. She had the wooden marker on Clara's grave replaced with a proper stone, and she stood there in the summer heat with Paul beside her and George and Clara Langston running in the grass outside the cemetery fence, and she said, she would have loved all of this. "Tell me about her," Paul said. She had told him pieces before, but now she told him more, the whole shape of Clara, the boldness and the warmth and the exclamation points, the way she had decided on Rook Fennessy at a church social and had him done in a month, the poetry books, the letters full of details about Kansas that she had never made sound like a sacrifice. Paul listened the way he listened to things that mattered completely. "She sounds like she was remarkable," he said. "She was ordinary," Edna said. "She was just very fully herself. That's what made her remarkable." He looked at her then, with something in his face that she knew by heart by now, and he said, "You're very fully yourself." "I had to learn to be," she said. "She taught me." On the ride back from Caldwell, with the children asleep against each other in the wagon bed and Colonel riding at the front with his nose into the wind, Paul reached across and took her hand, and they held on to each other across the flat land, under the enormous Kansas sky, going home to the crossroads. In the fall of 1889, Kansas was admitted to the Union as a state, and the territory became something more formal around them, though the land itself did not change. The crossroads were still the crossroads. The spring still ran from the source 300 yards inside the property boundary, as it had been recorded in 1874, and would presumably go on running indefinitely. The fence posts were straight and the water trough was clean, and Rosa still came every day except Sunday and still occasionally burned the bread, and Edna still made the bread on those occasions, and this was a system that worked. Davies and June had 2 more children after Will, a girl and another boy, and the Langston and Davies children constituted their own small world at the crossroads and the surrounding land, with the organized hierarchy that children establish among themselves without adult assistance. George was the oldest of all of them and took this seriously. Clara Langston was 2 years younger and took George seriously as a mission. Clem grew into a genuinely skilled rancher and became Paul's foreman when Davies and June moved north to their own small property, a transaction Paul had helped arrange, and for which Davies had expressed his gratitude in a way that was so plainly sincere it made Paul uncomfortable and Edna happy. Ortega stayed. Ortega was, Edna had come to understand, one of those people who belonged to a place so thoroughly that the place could not quite function without them, and this was a form of loyalty she recognized and respected. Paul went gray at the Temples slowly, beginning in his late 30s, And she found this beautiful in the way she found most things about him beautiful, which was with the specific depth of knowing what a person is and choosing them anyway. He was still the same man who had given her coffee at the kitchen table on the morning she arrived, the man who had paid Clayton Harper's debt for 14 months because the man had 4 children, the man who had said come back with his eyes saying something entirely different than his voice. She had never stopped noticing him. She had the feeling she never would. In the spring of 1891, a woman arrived at the Crossroads. She came on foot from Harlow Station, just as Edna had a decade before, with a bag over her arm and a look of determined composure that Edna recognized from the inside out. She was perhaps 25, with red hair pinned under a practical hat and the kind of eyes that have seen some things and decided not to be stopped by them. Her name was Violet Moore, and she had been traveling to a town called Merton to meet a man she had corresponded with about marriage, a cattle buyer named Whitfield, and she had arrived to find that Whitfield had died of a heart attack the previous week, and his family had not thought to inform her because they had not known about the correspondence. And she had her bag and about $2 and a specific kind of grief that was for the future she had imagined rather than the man himself, who she had never met. Edna fed her and gave her coffee and sat across the kitchen table from her, in the same chairs where she and Paul had sat that first morning, and she listened to Violet's story with the complete attention of someone who knew every part of it from the inside. "I don't know where I'm supposed to go," Violet said, with the careful composure of a woman who does not want to cry in a stranger's kitchen. "You're not supposed to go anywhere yet," Edna said. "You just arrived." Violet looked at the kitchen, the curtains, the shelf of books, the account ledger on the side table. "You built something good here," she said. "I arrived here by accident," Edna said. "2 towns short of where I was trying to get." Violet stared at her. "The ranch needed someone to manage the accounts," Edna continued, "and the rancher at the Crossroads decided I was close enough." It came out lighter than the truth of it was, and she heard Paul's footstep on the porch, and he came in and saw the guest and looked at Edna with the quiet inquiry that was one of his languages. "This is Violet Moore," Edna said. "She's had a difficult few days." "I've told her she can stay while she decides what's next," Paul said. "Of course, there's a room off the back." And then he went to pour coffee, and Edna caught the look he sent her as he turned, the warm, private look that said he understood completely, and she felt it the same way she always felt it, like the ground being solid under her feet. Violet stayed for 2 weeks, and in those 2 weeks she helped Edna with the accounts and proved to be quick with numbers, and she told the children stories in the evenings and showed George how to identify 3 different types of prairie grass, and she was, Edna thought, someone who would find her footing. She had that quality. On the day she left, she said to Edna on the porch, "How did you know to stay?" Edna thought about it. She thought about the morning walk on the empty road, and the carpetbag, and the $5.40, and Paul at the fence post with his hat pushed back, and the coffee, and the curtains, and the Harper debt, and the comeback, and the hand held across the kitchen table. "I didn't know," she said. "I just paid attention." Violet smiled and picked up her bag and walked down the road toward Harlow Station with the purposeful step of a woman who has found something to move toward, and Edna stood on the porch and watched her go. Paul came and stood beside her. Colonel sat at their feet, considerably older now, his muzzle going gray, but still present and still watchful. "She'll be all right," he said. "I know," Edna said. "She's the type who pays attention," she thought. The type who arrives somewhere unexpected and decides to see it clearly instead of only mourning what they missed. She leaned back slightly against Paul's shoulder and he put his arm around her. And the morning was warm, and the light was coming across the flat land at the long, golden angle of a Kansas autumn. And somewhere in the house, she could hear George and Clara arguing about something with the cheerful vehemence of children who are very safe and very loved. "Paul," she said, "do you remember what you said that first day? When I asked if I was close enough to where I was going," he was quiet for a moment, thinking back. "I said Caldwell was 2 towns on," he said. "You were close enough. You didn't actually say that was a good thing at the time. I was being diplomatic." "You were not being diplomatic. You were hoping I would stay." He looked at her, and after a moment he said, "Yes, I was hoping you would stay." She looked out at the land, at the wide, flat world of the Crossroads in the morning, and she thought about everything that had happened in the 10 years since that day. The accounts and the curtains and the spring record and the love and the children and the grief carried forward, and Clara's brooch in the box on the dresser and Edmund's visit, and the botanical illustrations and the creek stone, and the names spoken in the cold November room, and all of it, all of it. Growing from a stagecoach that had stopped 2 towns short, and a driver who had said, "This is where I leave you," and a woman who had decided to walk toward the crossroads, because she had no other direction to walk in. She had arrived at the best thing in her life by accident. She had stayed by choice. Those were not the same thing, and they were both important. "I think," she said quietly against the warmth of Paul's arm around her, "that this is exactly where I was going." He didn't say anything for a moment. Then he said, "I think so too." The sun kept moving across the sky the way it always did, and the land spread out around the crossroads in every direction. And the ranch was what it had always been, something built carefully, over time, by people who had committed to the work of it, and the house had curtains in the windows that she had made herself. And inside those windows, her children were beginning another ordinary morning with all its ordinary abundance. And the brindle hound who had loved her from the 5th week was sitting at their feet with his gray muzzle up, taking the sun. And Edna Graves Langston, who had arrived at the crossroads 2 towns short of her destination, who had been told she was close enough, and had discovered that close enough was the whole world, stood in the morning at the home she had not planned and leaned into the man who had been waiting at the gate. And she was, completely and without reservation, exactly where she was supposed to be.